cannot be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeat.
Hey church, today we're going to be diving into John chapter 13 verses 1 through 17, and it's the passage where it talks about Jesus washing his disciples' feet. There's a lot to unpack. There's so much information that ties into the resurrection and the crucifixion, and so just know that I'm only diving into it a little bit. There's just so much more that you could study and read about. If you want to read with me, I'm going to start at verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." And so we start with verse 1. It says that Jesus knew that his hour had come. And so we start to see that this is the beginning of the end. And Jesus used his last precious hours to serve and prepare his disciples. He could have been doing anything else, but this is what he chose to do as an example. And so we see the shadow of the cross all over this verse. We don't see him specifically mention that that's what's going to happen, but he implies it in saying his hour had come and saying that he loved them to the end. And so he's just giving us these soft hints of what's going to be this really harsh reality, that he would depart and leave this world only through the cross. And it continues to say, having loved his own. Who is his own, and why are they his own? So who is his own? His own are his 12 disciples and all of the disciples that were following him during that time. And why were they his own? Well, they were his own because he chose them. They were his own because he gave himself to them. They were his own because his Father gave them to him. They were his own because he would soon purchase them. They were his own because he conquered them, and they were his own because they yielded themselves to him. And he continues to say that he loved them to the end. And so I want us to remember who's talking. So we're reading through the Gospel of John, so this is his account. So he's talking about what had happened during this time, seeing that Jesus literally loved them to the end. He experienced this, he witnessed this. And so he loved all of his disciples. He even loved Judas Iscariot, knowing that he was about to betray him. And in a couple verses later in this chapter, Jesus even asks Peter, "Will you really lay down your life for me?" And so he truly laid down his life for them and for us, and he loved them to the end, even when it was going to when they were going to betray him later. And so to the end in this verse, the Greek word is eis telos, and I thought that was really interesting because it means to the utmost, to complete, to completion. And so I kept reading, and in chapter 19, verse 30, Jesus says, "It is finished." And in the Greek, that's tetelestai. And so tetelestai is the perfect tense of the verb telio, which is derived from telos, which is the same root as we were just talking about to the end. And so this ties the whole passion narrative together as a completion of Jesus's mission to love to the full and to the end. He literally did it until he died, and his love still goes on till today. And if we continue to read in verse 3, it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands. You're like, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, John's saying this, he wrote this, he believes it. He even said it when he was testifying about Jesus when he was baptizing people in chapter 3, verse 35. He said, the Father loves his Son and has placed everything in his hands. Now, this is important because think of what's going to happen. He is about to face the agony and the terror of the crucifixion, and Jesus knew that this was going to happen. He could have backed out at any time, but he knew that this was God's will for his life, so he kept going through with it. So Jesus went into this time as a victor. He didn't go in as a victim. He knew exactly what was going on. And so he didn't do this from a posture of weakness. He did this from a posture of authority, and we need to remember that. And so we continue to read through this chapter, Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. Now, this was a job that the lowest servant in the household was supposed to do. This isn't something that the King of Kings should have been doing, but Jesus didn't think of himself in this moment. He was thinking about his disciples. He was truly loving them until the end, even when they were about to forsake him. And so in verse 4, it says that he got up and took off his outer clothing, or in other versions it says, lay aside his garments. Just like in a few hours, he would be stripped of his garments to be crucified. And so he began washing his feet, and instead of simply sharing and speaking about a parable about being a true servant and being humble, he acted out this parable himself. He taught and displayed this idea of servanthood and true humility. And so there's a couple of statements that we're going to see that connect right with the cross and the crucifixion and his death, even from this passage of him washing people's feet. So Jesus rose from supper, a place of rest and comfort. And later we see Jesus rose from his throne, a place of rest and comfort. Jesus laid aside his garments, taking off his covering. Jesus laid aside his glory, taking off his heavenly covering. Jesus took a towel and girded himself, being ready to work. Jesus took the form of a servant and came ready to work. Jesus poured his water into a basin, ready to clean. Jesus poured out his blood to cleanse us from the guilt and penalty of sin. Jesus sat down again after washing their feet. Jesus sat down at the right hand of God after cleansing us. And if we continue to read in verse 8, he says, unless I wash you, you have no part in me. Okay, so what does that mean? Peter had gone through all this arguing, saying, Jesus, you're not going to wash my feet. You're not the one who's supposed to do that. We should be washing your feet. Peter was acting out, but in the end, he had to accept Jesus washing his feet, because it shows us that if we do not accept the humble service of Jesus to cleanse us, we have no part from him. And he even says that even though he physically washed the feet of his disciples, not all of them were clean. Just like Judas, he had no part with Jesus because he didn't allow him to be cleansed in that sense, even though he did it physically. So it's important to know that it's not the physical part of cleaning that matters here. It's the acceptance of Jesus and his humble and lowly service. And so it says in verse 13 through 16, it says, you have called me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you have also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent them. Now, if we remember in Mark and Matthew's account, they state that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so I think it's really cool that in John's account, he showed this. He gave this example of Jesus not coming to be served, but to serve others. Jesus is doing it. He shows us. He tells us about it. This is what he has come to do. And so being a servant isn't worth much, but the practice of being a servant is. We need to remember that. And with all that being said, we need to remember that this is John's account, okay? He had the apostolic authority to tell this and to tell other people about what he experienced. And so people of the church about 60 years after the death of Christ was asking him these questions. What did you see? What did Jesus do? What was it like? And so the church is asking him these questions. And if we go back, it says that Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all these things into his hands. That's really important because we need to remember that this was not suicide by cross. Jesus knew everything that was going to happen. He believed it. I mean, John said it and he believed it twice. He knew he knew that everything was in God's hands. He was in control of the situation the whole time, and it wasn't a surprise to him. And so the church dealt with some of the same questions that we're dealing with today. Is God in control? What's happening? Why is Jesus doing this? What is he talking about? The reality is still the same 2,000 years after the death of Jesus than it was 60 years after the death of Jesus. Even though we don't see it, he is working and he is in control. And so my question for you, and something that I've been thinking about in my life, is do we believe that Jesus is in control right now? You know, my dad was saying this the other day, that crisis brings clarity. In the midst of all of this that Jesus was going through in his death and crucifixion on the cross, people didn't know what was going to happen after. They didn't know that he was going to be resurrected. Just like we don't know what's going to be happening now after this. What's the world going to look like? You know, are things going to go back to normal? But do we believe that he is in control? Just like he was in control then, he knew everything that was leading up to his betrayal and his crucifixion. He knew that after he would be sitting at the right hand of God, and he knew that he'd be resurrected and living in us today. And so I want us to think about that. Do you think that Jesus is in control now of your life? Do we have peace that we know what he's doing, even in the midst of everything that's going on, all of this fear, all of this anxiety, all of this sickness? What's God doing? And we don't know, but we know that at the end of this, the sun's going to rise. I mean, physically, and he already has. You know, Jesus died and he rose again. And so are we going to let him take control of what's happening now in all of this chaos? Or are we just going to kind of still have that idea of Jesus is dead, there's darkness, nothing's going to happen? But no, we need to believe that he is here, he's with us, he knows what's happening. Even if we don't see it, he's going to continue to work, and it's all going to be for our good. So that we're praying that in this crisis, clarity comes out of this, and that our love is displayed through him, just like he showed to us. And just like the example he gave us of servanthood, we should be serving others in this time, because it talks about also in the Bible that we love because he first loved us. So we need to love others. We need to serve others in the midst of this time, and just know that he is in control. So that is my prayer for us today, to have this peace and this comfort and knowing that God is in control in the midst of all of this.